The agitation to arm the slaves with the promise of freedom had another motive besides the reinforcement of Lee's army. It was intended to serve as a basis for negotiations with England and France. To that end, D.J. Keener was dispatched to Europe early in 1865. Passing through New York in disguise, he carried word of this revolutionary program to the Confederate commissioners abroad. A conference at Paris was held by Keener, Mason, and Slidell. Mason, who had gone over to England to sound Palmerston with regard to the last Confederate hope, was received on the 14th of March. On the previous day, Davis had accepted temporary defeat by signing the compromise bill which omitted emancipation. But as there were no cables operating at the time, Mason was not aware of this rebuff. In his own words, he urged upon Lord P. that if the President was right in his impressions that there was some latent, undisclosed obstacle on the part of Great Britain to recognition, it should be frankly stated, and we might, if in our power to do so, consent to remove it. Palmerston, though his manner was conciliatory and kind, insisted that there was nothing underlying his previous statements and that he could not, in view of the fact then existing, regard the Confederacy in the light of an independent power. Mason parted from him convinced that the most ample concessions on our part in the matter referred to would have produced no change in the course determined by the British government with regard to recognition. In a subsequent interview with Lord Donoughmore, he was frankly told that the offer of emancipation had come too late. The dispatch in which Mason reported the attitude of the British government never reached the Confederate authorities. It was dated the 31st of March. 2 days later, Richmond was evacuated by the Confederate government. The evacuation of Richmond broke the back of the Confederate defense. Congress had adjourned. The legislative history of the Confederacy was at an end. The executive history still had a few days to run. After destroying great quantities of records, the government officials had packed the remainder on a long train that conveyed the President and what was left of the civil service to Danville. During a few days, Danville was the Confederate capital. There, Davis, still unable to conceive defeat, issued his pathetic last address to the people of the Confederate States. His mind was crystallized. He was no longer capable of judging facts. In as confident tones as ever, he promised his people that they should yet prevail. He assured Virginians that even if the Confederate army should withdraw farther south, the withdrawal would be but temporary, and that again and again will we return until the battled and baffled and exhausted enemy shall abandon in despair his endless and impossible task of making slaves of a people resolved to be free. The surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, compelled another migration of the dwindling executive company. General Johnston had not yet surrendered. A conference which he had with the President and the Cabinet at Greensboro ended in giving him permission to negotiate with Sherman. Even then, Davis was still bent on keeping up the fight. Yet, though he believed that Sherman would reject Johnston's overtures, he was overtaken at Charleston on his way south by the crushing news of Johnston's surrender. There the executive history of the Confederacy came to an end in a final cabinet meeting. Davis, still blindly resolute to continue the struggle, was deeply distressed by the determination of his advisers to abandon it. In imminent danger of capture, the President's party made its way to Abbeville, where it broke up and each member sought safety as best he could. Davis, with a few faithful men, rode to Irwinsville, Georgia, where in the early morning of the 10th of May he was surprised and captured. But the history of the Confederacy was not quite at an end. The last gunshots were still to be fired far away in Texas on the 13th of May. The surrender of the forces of the Trans-Mississippi on May 26, 1865, brought the war to a definite conclusion. There remains one incident of these closing days, the significance of which was not perceived until long afterward, when it immediately took its rightful place among the determining events of American history. The unquenchable spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia found its last expression in a proposal which was made to Lee by his officers. If he would give the word, they would make the war a duel to the death. It should drag out in relentless guerrilla struggles, and there should be no pacification of the South until the fighting classes had been exterminated. Considering what those classes were, considering the qualities that could be handed on to their posterity, one realizes that this suicide of a whole people, of a noble fighting people, would have maimed the America of the future. But through the heroism of this proposal of his men to die on their shields had its stern charm for so brave a man as Lee, he refused to consider it. He would not admit that he and his people had a right thus to extinguish their power to help mold the future, no matter whether it be the future they desired or not. The result of battle must be accepted. The Southern spirit must not perish, luxuriating blindly in despair, but must find a new form of expression, must become part of the new world that was to be, must look to a new birth under new conditions. In this spirit, Lee issued to his army his last address, and I quote, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles, who have remained steadfast to the last, that I have consented to the result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that would have attended the continuation of the contest. I determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endured them to their countrymen. I bid you an affectionate farewell." Unquote.